Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this PPI launch event to launch the report Engaging with ESG Climate Change. My name's Chris Curry. I'm Director of the Pensions Policy Institute. I'll just say a few words about the PPI for those of you who don't know too much about us or haven't been to a PPI event before. We are an educational research organisation and our aim is to improve retirement outcomes through an evidence-based and research. So we do this by being part of the policy debate, running events like this and undertaking reports like this, providing objective analysis, facts and modelling to help shape decision making. We are completely independent and we don't lobby for any specific cause or outcome. And we've been working this, some of you may have seen, this is our 20th anniversary this year. So we've been doing this for a number of years, just 2 decades now. But the retirement pensions and later life market are still undergoing significant changes brought about in areas such as legislation, technology, the economy, and we feel that robust independent analysis has never been more important than it is now to help shape future policy decisions. The topic that we are talking about today, ESG, is one where the PPI has done research before. Back in 2018, we did work looking at definitions of ESG and potential barriers to the pensions world moving into and taking up ESG options and using ESG factors in decision making. Since then, there's been a lot more of development of policy and legislation in particular to encourage trustees and providers to become more informed about the financial implications of ESG and the risks associated with them. And climate change has been one of the bigger ESG risks which has received attention so far in the process. This report and this launch is part of a series that the PPI is undertaking. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank not only the Phoenix Group, who are the sponsors of this report today, but also the other report sponsors and series sponsors, Newton Investment Management, the ABI, Baker McKenzie, the PLSA and Scottish Widows. In this series, the first report was published back in December, which was Engaging with ESG, the story so far, to give an introduction and overview of the ESG landscape. This particular report, which we're going to hear about today, provides a detailed dive into the implications and issues surrounding climate change. A further report is going to be published in April, which will explore consideration of ESG as a whole by pension scheme investors. So let's get underway. We have a number, and we're very lucky to be joined by a number of really excellent speakers today, and I will introduce each of them as we go through rather than all at the start, because we may have forgotten some by the time we get through to the end. But I'd like to kick off with a welcome from, as I mentioned, Phoenix Group, our research sponsors. For this, I'm going to hand over to Michael Eakins, who is the Chief Investment Officer at Phoenix Group. Michael.
Thanks a lot, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to the virtual launch of the Pension Policy Institute's latest research report, Engaging with ESG Climate Change. Thank you very much for dialing into this launch event. So I'm Mike Eakins, the Chief Investment Officer of the Phoenix Group, and I'm pleased to say that of all the people speaking on this afternoon's VC, my task is perhaps the most straightforward. I'm going to spend a few minutes explaining why Phoenix has sponsored this research and worked alongside a distinguished consortium to produce this report, along with why we believe it is significant. As a society, we have never been more climate conscious, and this report shows that the pensions industry is no different. There is no time to waste. Where people's money is invested can and will have a huge impact on the world our children and grandchildren inherit. This is why the Phoenix Group was eager to be involved in the Pensions Policy Institute's thought-provoking research series, which cuts through much of the confusion surrounding ESG and climate change. This report on ESG and climate change also provides recommendations on how pension schemes can engage with this more effectively. As a business, we are committed to reducing our impact on the environment. We are supporting the goals of the Paris Agreement. We've committed to be net zero in our operations by 2025 and in our investment portfolio by 2050, and to continue to increase the amount we invest into green assets. Our net zero target includes all the unit-linked fund solutions we design for our pension savers with our investment partners. What is clear is that there is no quick or easy fix to the issues we face. Both industry and government must work hand in hand. I would like to thank the PPI for producing this rigorous piece of research and in taking the conversation forward to address one of the most defining issues of our time and to help lead the way to a more sustainable future. Thank you. We hope that Phoenix's sponsorship of this research is a significant and useful contribution to this discussion, and we are ready to play our part. I would also like to say thanks to the team at the PPI for their hard work in producing this rigorous research report, along with all of the panelists speaking at today's event. Finally, I want to thank everyone dialed into today's VC for taking the time out of your busy schedules whilst we balance the pressures of working through a pandemic. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand over to Lauren.
So I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors, not only for their role as sponsors of the research series, but also for their input as members of the steering group that's fed into this research series, as well as DWP, who joined the steering group in an advisory capacity. And I would also like to thank everyone that participated in our Engaging with ESG survey last year, and also the follow-up interviews that I've done since then that have helped to inform this report. So thank you all. Without your input, it wouldn't have been as interesting a research series. So thank you for your insights. So now moving on to my presentation of the research findings. So with rapid regulatory changes that we've seen and the growing materiality of risks in many ESG areas, the financial implications of ESG considerations are becoming increasingly important as part of pension schemes' investment decisions. And this is especially true of climate change. Climate change considerations have received a great deal of focus from both policymakers and also social movements around the globe. However, while some schemes and others involved in the investment process, such as pension providers, asset managers, and consultants, are leading the way on mitigating these risks that are associated with climate change, there are still others who may need greater support or even intervention to catch up. So this report explores the way in which pension scheme investment currently takes into account climate change within the current regulatory landscape, as well as the future opportunities and challenges, and proposals for more effective support to encourage evolution and improve risk mitigation going forward. So today I'm going to give you an overview of some of the key findings coming out of the report, and I'm going to cover three main areas in my presentation today. First of all, how are schemes approaching climate change, specifically in contrast to other areas of ESG. As I said, there's quite a focus on climate change right now, so that's something that we've seen coming out of the research. Then I'll move on to the role that members play in climate change approaches and how that might develop going forward. And finally, I'll talk you through some of the practical steps that might be needed to overcome barriers relating to climate change investment. We've identified 5 key areas where development might be needed to encourage greater engagement and better integration of these risks. So what we've found while carrying out the research and our Engaging with ESG survey last year is that climate change is a top priority for many schemes. So because of the growing regulation and the significant focus on climate change across society more broadly, and initiatives that are targeted specifically at institutional investors and getting them to engage more on climate change risks are increasingly difficult for pension schemes to ignore. And in recent years, climate change has been increasingly at the forefront of media coverage as the frequency of extreme climate events and climate change protest movements has increased, and the pressure to take action on climate change has just been growing and growing. So, although the majority of schemes consider ESG holistically with one kind of overarching strategy, we have found that around a third of schemes in the Engaging with ESG survey said that they consider climate change to be their top priority at the moment when they're making decisions about their investment strategy in terms of design and also implementation. So it's a real kind of top priority at the moment. Compared to other ESG factors, climate change is more likely to be specifically referenced in scheme SIPs, although we do find that the detail tends to be fairly limited, even on climate change where there's a focus. So a review of 30 SIPs carried out at the end of 2019 found that climate change was the only individual area of ESG that was mentioned. And half of the SIPs reviewed mentioned climate change specifically, but generally only in passing rather than setting out a climate change approach in any detail. And most were using the exact words that come from the ESG regulations on SIPs. So they typically referred to ESG issues such as climate change. So really focusing in on that, but not delving any deeper in terms of what their approach might be specifically to climate change. Only 2 of the SIPs reviewed discussed climate change in any level of detail, briefly discussing the ways in which climate change poses risks to scheme investments. So, despite a greater focus on climate change compared to other areas of ESG, very few schemes are using a differentiated approach to this issue. So 3/4 of schemes in the Engaging with ESG survey say that they use a single holistic approach to cover all ESG considerations. And there are both benefits and disadvantages to both differentiated and holistic strategies. So on the one hand, using a differentiated approach might produce a strategy that more effectively considers and responds to the specific nature of risks within each area, so within climate change, other environmental areas, social, and then governance separately. And that might offer a greater level of risk mitigation. However, the additional risk mitigation provided might not offer the best value for money if the associated resource and governance costs of developing each individual strategy outweigh the benefits. And developing a differentiated approach for each area is likely to be correlated with higher costs and governance demands that many schemes, particularly DC schemes, are not likely to have the time or the resource to be able to do. There's also a concern that using a differentiated strategy for climate change might mean that some parts of the scheme's investment portfolio don't adequately protect member savings from other ESG risks. So because we've seen that climate change is really a priority for a lot of schemes, if they focus too much of their strategy on that area, they might be ignoring other material risks in social and governance areas. So for most schemes, the most appropriate approach is likely to be one that involves developing specific climate change policies that contribute to a broader holistic strategy. So that's ensuring that climate change is not prioritised to the detriment of other ESG areas. While schemes will need to develop internal policies and approaches to climate change, most will not be directly involved in designing an investment strategy that takes account of these risks, as many, particularly DC schemes, don't have the scale to design and implement their own investment strategy directly. So they're depending on the off-the-shelf solutions that are offered by pension providers, and that means that in many cases it's the provider rather than the scheme that's engaging with external asset managers. So they're quite dependent on what they're able to access. So it's really important that they engage with their provider in that instance to make sure that they're offering things that meet the policies that they've set out internally. The report also explores some of the investment approaches available to schemes, from divestment or exclusion on the one hand through to higher engagement strategies. But for most schemes, a combination of these strategies together will be most appropriate. Really, the only strategy that schemes shouldn't be using now is just ignoring climate change and ESG altogether. So as pension schemes' focus on climate change has grown, so too has the discussion of member views in this area and the role that they might play in determining future investment strategies. So this area of member views is a little bit different to what the rest of the report discusses, which is more around the kind of technical investment decisions and those that are involved in that investment process. But it's a really fascinating area, thinking about the way in which member views might be taken into account going forward and whether they'll have a bigger influence going forward. And what we're seeing is that some schemes are increasingly choosing to engage with members on climate change in order to inform their decisions about investment strategy. So member engagement on ESG and climate change varies considerably across the industry. When asked about the extent to which member views and expectations factored into the investment decision-making process, responses to our Engaging with ESG survey ranged from very little engagement or consideration of member views to much more active engagement processes among some schemes. So, understandably, given the distribution of risk, defined benefit schemes are less likely to take member views into account, and most DB schemes in the survey said that member views were considered minimally or not at all. Although a small number of DB respondents did suggest a larger role for member views. We had one respondent that said, member views, if provided proactively, were considered, but were not the driving factor. And another saying that member views were given through member representatives, such as member-nominated trustees and trade unions. Whereas DC schemes in the survey were more likely to take a more active approach to gathering member views. And we also found that 3/4 of respondents to the survey said that they expect member views to have a greater influence on scheme behaviour in the future. So, although people are becoming more engaged on climate change generally, direct member engagement with pension schemes is still quite low. Increased societal focus on environmental movements, as they've led to the increase of focus on climate change among pension schemes, have also led to a growth in awareness and engagement among the general population. However, members do not engage directly very often with their pension schemes on these issues, and take-up of the active surveys that have been referenced by some of the schemes in our survey can also be quite low. So one consultant who responded to the Engaging with ESG survey said that while member views are actively and regularly engaged and suggestions sought by the schemes that they advise, engagement from members remains limited. And this is likely because levels of engagement with pensions in general tend to be quite low and are unlikely to be substantially increased by concern for the climate alone. Low levels of engagement with pensions can result from a combination of low levels of financial capability, inertia, and communication challenges. And engagement can be particularly difficult to measure, especially since the introduction of automatic enrolment, with there being no active choice now needed to join a workplace pension scheme. So one of the ways that it can potentially be measured is by looking at the proportion of scheme members who are actively registered to access their account online. And this is only around 1 in 10 members, which suggests that very few members are actively engaging with their pot at all, let alone looking into the details of how their scheme's investing on climate change or other ESG issues. However, some members are especially engaged on climate change, and they might be driven to increase engagement with their scheme on this basis, particularly as there are now collective initiatives popping up, such as Make My Money Matter, for example, that aim to increase awareness among scheme members of the impact that their pension investments are having, and to mobilise them to engage with their scheme on these issues. However, for most members, an interest or concern around climate change will not be enough to incite engagement without efforts to increase pension engagement more generally. And there is some evidence that a greater focus on ESG and climate change can increase engagement, but this will need to be monitored over the longer term to assess what the full impact will be, especially as we have younger generations who are more engaged on climate change and other ESG issues as they become more engaged with pensions in general. And one of the issues with measuring this engagement and the role of responsible investment and climate change in increasing engagement is that much of the existing research on the link between the two relies on members self-reporting hypothetical behaviour that they might take to increase their engagement if responsible investment was more of a focus of their pension scheme's investment strategy, rather than evidence of actual increases in engagement. But as we're now seeing a much greater focus on responsible investment and climate change and pension scheme strategies, there's more opportunity to measure what the impact will be on engagement. What's really important is the communication of these issues to members and seeing whether that will then increase their engagement. But it's, of course, as with everything in pensions and when we're looking at engagement, really important to make sure that any communications around this employ simple and accessible language to ensure that members are not discouraged from engaging by the use of industry jargon. So that is likely to be quite a key area going forward and one that will be really interesting to watch. Based on the barriers to greater engagement and integration that we've identified in the research, the report identifies 5 key areas for development that may help. I'm going to talk through these quite quickly, but it'd be really interesting to hear if there are any other areas during the discussion, or if you have questions around these or ideas of how they might work, would be really interesting to hear. So the first development area that we identified was around integrated goals. So establishing a consensus across all stakeholders, including government, schemes, providers and asset managers, on goals and the practical steps that might be needed to achieve them, to ensure that climate change considerations are integrated across the investment landscape by a certain date. And really this first development area encompasses all the others, because we would need joined up behaviour across the industry and government to be able to achieve the following development goals. So the next one identified in the report is around engagement and stewardship. So the need for a greater focus on engagement and stewardship activities by schemes or those who are acting on their behalf to ensure that companies across the board are making progress towards the climate change goals that have been identified in that first step. Next on the list is encouraging innovation from third parties. So as I said, when we were talking through the way that schemes are approaching climate change, many schemes are heavily dependent on either pension providers or external asset managers or both for their approach to climate change and their investment strategy. So there may be a need from government, regulators, industry bodies, as well as schemes themselves to put pressure on those involved in schemes' approach to climate change to make sure they're providing the products and strategies that meet the needs of schemes and integrating these risks, as well as improving the data that they're providing schemes about their own activities relating to climate change to make sure that schemes have the knowledge that they need to be able to make choices about the providers and asset managers that they're using. And linked to that point, there's a real need to increase knowledge and understanding. So as we've seen rapid regulatory changes happening, there has been an increase in awareness and understanding across the industry, but there are still some gaps. So it's vital to improve scheme decision makers' knowledge and understanding of climate change across the whole industry, especially around the more practical aspects such as the implications of different investment approaches. And this could be standardised and measured, for example, through a specific training module in TPR's Trustee Toolkit, just as one option, but there may be others. And finally, standardised data. So producing a centralised data source which can provide as a starting point for schemes that are unsure where to begin or are overwhelmed by the quantity of data available, particularly given the inconsistency across different metrics on climate change and ESG. This was one of the biggest barriers that came out of the Engaging with ESG survey, schemes saying that they didn't know where to start or were overwhelmed by the amount of data that was available. There obviously is a lot of data on climate change available, but it's hard for schemes to know which they should be listening to when there's quite a disparity between different sources. So this would likely need to be a collaborative effort across the industry to agree upon some standardised metrics and analytics tools, as well as standardised language, first and foremost, to be used when talking about climate change and other ESG considerations. And these joined up goals, strategies and data sources across all stakeholders are likely to improve the way that schemes can engage with climate change, not just schemes, but all the others who are involved in the investment decision-making process on their behalf. So, as I said, it would be really interesting to hear your views on those areas of development that we've identified and your experience if you represent a scheme or work in this area of the barriers that you've faced. But now I'll hand back to Chris, and I look forward to hearing from you in the discussion section. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lauren. Really, really good overview of the research and the report, and I think really setting up nicely the discussion for later on. And as Lauren mentioned, we will be having a discussion session and then some questions and answers generally from the floor. Before we get to that, we have a couple more presentations or contributions, I should say, to make, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce our next speaker to give a response or a viewpoint from the pensions regulator, David Fairs, who is the Executive Director, Regulatory Policy Analysis and Advice at the Pensions Regulator, and I'm also delighted to say a Governor of the Pensions Policy Institute. So David, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and let me begin by thanking you, Laura, for an excellent paper. And I should add my thanks to Phoenix for the sponsorship and, of course, PPI for hosting this event on what I think is a really important area. And it's probably worth me saying right up front that at the Pensions Regulator, we also see climate change and ESG as incredibly important areas. And that's why we'll be shortly publishing our own strategy on climate change. Now, this pandemic, I think, has probably emphasised and reinforced why we need to think about sustainability. But I recognise that today we're focusing very much on climate change. Lauren talks about this as being a very fast-changing area, and of course it is. And I think we've all probably lost a sense of time through the pandemic. But it's worth reflecting on the fact that it was only in July 2019 that the government published its Green Finance Strategy, setting out government's ambition, including around greening the financial system. And I noted that in the first meeting of the G7 last Friday, climate change was one of the key items that was discussed there. And so I think we should recognise that the ambition to green the financial system is a bold one. It's complex and it's happening at pace. And that might mean that we encounter and have to live with some of the challenges which Lauren's paper calls out. Specifically, the report calls out the varying levels of understanding around climate change and ESG issues, the fact that data isn't always complete, sometimes not validated or consistent. But as you all know, the Pension Schemes Act 2021 is going to place a requirement on master trusts, large schemes with assets of over 5 billion, and CDC arrangements to make climate-related disclosures from October this year. As Lauren points out, for trustees to be able to show that information and comply with the requirements, they need investment managers to be able to provide them with the right information. In turn, investment managers need to obtain information from individual companies that they invest in. And at the moment, that information isn't always complete, consistent, or available. The challenge of getting that whole ecosystem to work was recognised in the Green Finance Strategy, and it set out that all regulators needed to work together to achieve it. Which is why in November last year, the Chancellor set out the roadmap, referred in the Green Finance Strategy as the interim report, describing how BEIS and FRC were going to impose climate-related disclosures on corporates, the FCA would impose requirements on investment managers, the PRA on insurers and banks, and hence how DWP were going to impose requirements on trustees, supported and regulated by the pensions regulator. One of the challenges that we faced is that we each have very different mechanisms on how we can introduce and regulate those requirements. When we met as a steering group, there was a unanimous feeling that this was really important, that it was urgent, and that we should be ambitious in terms of time frame. Now, you could argue that it would be more structured, perhaps smoother, to impose the requirements on companies, then investment managers and insurers, and lastly on trustees. But our feeling was that that was just going to take too long. So we do have the requirements in the Pension Schemes Act, building, as Lauren said, on the regulations already in force, that required climate to be considered as part of the Statement of Investment Principles in DC schemes from 2019, DB schemes from 2020, and implementation statements again from October 2020. Had we not had the pandemic, it's likely that we at the Pensions Regulator would have already tested the extent of compliance through both our one-to-one supervision of schemes and through a regulatory initiative where we ask each scheme to demonstrate compliance with the requirements. Now, as you know, right at the beginning of the pandemic, we paused regulatory initiatives, but it is something that we have under continuous review. In terms of how we'll test compliance, that's going to be set out in our climate strategy paper that we'll be publishing this spring. It will set out a number of key areas: how we'll raise awareness and understanding of climate change, guidance and support for those needing to comply with climate-related disclosures in the first wave, and highlighting good practice to those who follow in subsequent waves. It will also set out how we'll enforce against those not complying with regulations, and how we'll continue to work with other regulators to make the ecosystem work. We recognise because of the pace that we're moving at, good practice will develop and change a lot in the next few years. There's a lot of complementary work being done by the Pensions Climate Risk Industry Group, the PLSA, the Climate Risk Forum, the Large Asset Owner Group. It doesn't make sense necessarily for us to duplicate the good work that's being done by others, but we will look to highlight some of that work and build on it as appropriate. And recognising that practice will develop and evolve quickly, we're taking on board suggestions such as that from the Association of Consulting Actuaries that we should produce an annual climate statement. We do that at the moment. We produce an annual funding statement for defined benefit schemes, but this would look at climate-related disclosures, help schemes stay abreast of developments around climate change. It's a really interesting idea, and it's one that we'll reflect on whether we can realistically do that. So no firm commitment as yet, but we are really thinking about it. Just let me summarise. So do look out for our strategy, our guidance and future blogs on climate change. Learn to understand the pace of change, where you can find help and support. And on day one, data and information flows may well not be perfect. The Act and regulations will allow for that and will be disproportionate in our regulatory approach. But I think things will improve quickly. And so it's a very exciting and dynamic area to be involved with. I'm fairly sure the PPI will be holding a number of future events in this area, setting out how things have developed and evolved. And I very much look forward to that. So thank you very much, Chris, and back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, David. And I'm sure you're right. I'm sure this is the first of many occasions in which we will be starting to chart progress in this area and see how it takes hold in the future. So if I can now hand over to our next contributors, who are Gareth Trainor, who is Head of Unit Linked Investment Solutions at Phoenix Group, and Sindhu Krishna, who is Head of Responsible Investments at the Phoenix Group, who are going to make a response on behalf of our sponsors. Thank you. Over to you, Gareth and Sindhu.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I just, I suppose, like to echo again my thanks to you guys at the PPI, Lauren in particular, for doing all the hard work, but especially for the opportunity to support this particular report within the series. I won't repeat how important climate change is or otherwise, because I think everyone's already done a very good job of that. I suppose I'd start with my reflections by picking a couple of bits and pieces out and then handing over to Sindhu. I think my first reflection is that we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of the customer here. Regulatory interventions has prompted, a lot of activity, and it's all for a good reason. And my understanding of that reason is to allow us to consider the impact of climate change on our customers' investments and their outcomes. So while we're all busy doing what we need to do with regards to climate change, we can't forget that very, very simple fact. Now, as Lauren said earlier, the report says that 3/4 of respondents believe member views will have an increasing influence on investment decisions in the future. But apart from a knowledgeable few, member understanding is very basic. Views are expressed commonly as a desire to do good versus bad or do right from wrong. And of course, that feeds into the frequent debate about whether positions are financial risks or moral judgments, and whether or not actually the maturity, if you like, of customer views are where they need to be. So in the future, will regular surveys and insight allow customer views to be increasingly reflected in strategies? Probably, especially with the two-stage test already baked into the rules. But right now, I'm not convinced views are mature enough to go too far. But when member views do mature, we shouldn't underestimate the impact that they will have on everything that we do in this space. So this point about not forgetting the customer aligns itself wholly with Lauren's first proposal of having clear integrated goals across the industry. I suppose related to that point, I'm also wondering who will capture these views and decide how to apply them into strategies. Large schemes probably find this very simple to do, but with smaller schemes who may use, say, a provider's off-the-shelf solution, that becomes more problematic, especially if we have multiple schemes all using the same solution, but with very different views as to what they want to apply. Therefore, whatever we do agree needs to take into account both the market dynamics at all levels, not just at large schemes. Now, the second point I'd kind of call out, I suppose, is as an industry, I think we've got a real opportunity here to do good things. Managing climate change as a topic has got real momentum, and be that from the government, regulators, boardroom, shareholders, industry stakeholders, and importantly, customers. There's, relatively speaking, nobody getting in our way of making a real difference here. Yet this research is clearly calling out some issues and blockers that is getting in the way, whether that's industry participants wanting to be brought up to speed, knowledge training, or the availability of data report, whatever it may be. Those issues are all there, and that's why we absolutely wholeheartedly endorse Lauren's proposals at the end of this paper. Now, while I'm not professing to have any of the answers to these challenges at all, it is clear that we do need to get our ducks in a row. There are many parties trying to provide leadership in this space, and actually, ESG in some instances is being used as a tool to provide competitive advantage. And because of these things, we risk as an industry having too many cooks and not enough collaboration to actually lead to that singular view of where we're actually looking to get to really maximize this opportunity. And historically, when the industry does come together to solve problems, we can achieve great things. And I do think this is one of those times where it feels like a joined up approach will achieve so much more than by acting in our own interests. Now, on that, I'd like to hand over to Sindhu Krishna, our Head of Responsible Investments, to try and get her thoughts on the report as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm very delighted to join like-minded colleagues from the industries who share the passion and commitment to this subject as I have. Firstly, I'll start by thanking Lauren and the PPI for this wonderful research report and insights, and for the hard work and efforts gone for this report. So thank you. I'll just start from a macro perspective. Whether we call it an Attenborough effect, a Greta effect, or a Marconi effect, the awareness of a society to climate change is exponentially increasing and continues to do so. In our professional world, or even in our whichever industry we belong to, we are bombarded with loads of information on the effects of climate change, the risks and the opportunities. On the risk side, we see the impact of physical risks on the loss of biodiversity, mass migration, food insecurity, what it does to communities, especially those in vulnerable countries. In terms of the impact on the society as such, we have seen evidence through the pandemic. We are seeing the effect that it can have, especially driving people below the poverty line in vulnerable countries. Again, looking on the other side of the coin, the opportunity side, we have seen a huge number of reports from the World Bank, from the United Nations in terms of the funding gap that is there, calling on the private sector to join forces to bridge these funding gaps to deliver not only just for the climate change related activities, but also the wider UN SDGs or the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is a call for the private sector to join in from an opportunity perspective as well. I was looking at one of the World Bank reports which suggests investing in resilient infrastructure in developing countries means that every dollar invested has a $4 benefit. So there is an argument both for opportunities and risk. Even against this macro backdrop, against this backdrop of awareness from society as well as from the industry, what this research report is showing is that there are a number of headwinds to schemes to integrate these considerations in a meaningful way. And I'm sure a lot of us it resonates with many of us, the factors that Lauren showed in the last slide of her presentation in terms of the issues facing us all. I'd just like to share my thoughts from a Phoenix perspective and also more generally observations from the report on a couple of those factors. One of them, the first one, is the understanding. We're all on this journey. It's a cliche when we start a journey on ESG and climate change, and it's a journey which we're continuing to be on for a very long time, as this whole knowledge and understanding evolves. The key there, though, is that the understanding is just not for few people in the organization, for few teams. It's the holistic commitment. And from a Phoenix perspective, when we started the journey, we undertook a gap analysis, where we are, where we want to be, and how we want to get there. Lauren has a similar view, a beautiful chart from Mercer, which shows the different steps that we can get on in order to get ourselves on a journey, and that plan, the short, medium, long term, into how we want to get there and how we will work there. That roadmap is crucial. And again, I just want to flag that this is not just for a handful of individuals to do that. This is for organizations to do that holistically, not just investment portfolios, but for us as organizations across all areas of the business. And this is the approach that we've taken at Phoenix. Going on to the other one, a key one is data. I'm conscious that other speakers have also mentioned this, and I expect that any discussion on ESG and climate would be incomplete without reference to data. So again, there's numerous providers, and if we go down the value chain, whether it's schemes, providers, going to asset managers, and there are vendors, and there's numerous vendors coming in. And for those of us who are looking at those data, what's obvious is that there is limited correlation. And these research reports, whether it's an ESG rating from one vendor, would look different to another. And so does the analysis when it comes to climate change, and especially so when you're looking at it from a forward-looking perspective. So amongst all this, there's this absolute need for us to come together and work together. And I can share a great experience we've had at Phoenix for collaborating with another network, which is the Institutional Investors Group on climate change. This call for us all to come together is absolutely crucial. We've learned a great deal through that exercise, and we absolutely look forward for working through the PPI and other industry collaborations to bring together, to consolidate that knowledge and support standardization. I'd like to finish by thanking again Lauren and echoing a number of those considerations and looking forward for the collaboration and continuing discussion on the other topics which was mentioned in her report. For now, I'll just hand back to Chris. Thanks, Chris.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sindhu. Thank you very much, Gareth. Two really thoughtful contributions there, which I think, again, are going to be unpacked a little bit as we get further into the discussion and potentially some of your questions and answers coming in.